My dear friends, it is an odd but rather unfortunate fact that the human mind is the primary battlefield of the unseen war. For if one wishes to destroy a man, one does not begin with his body. That is too obvious, too crude. No, the surest way to unravel him is to go for his mind, to twist his thoughts, to lead him quite gently at first into believing things that are not true. And so it should not surprise us that our minds are under attack. We live in a world where spiritual forces, both good and evil, are at work, though the modern mind scoffs at such a notion. The great enemy of our souls is no fool. He does not storm the gates of the mind with banners waving and trumpets blaring. He does not declare his presence or demand immediate surrender. Instead, he prefers whispers to shouts, half-truths to outright lies, slow erosion to sudden collapse. He is, if nothing else, patient. Consider how easily our thoughts can be led astray. One day a man walks in confidence, certain of God's love and his own purpose. Then, as subtly as the shifting of the wind, doubt creeps in. It begins as a suggestion, just a passing thought. What if God is not as good as I once believed? Or what if I am too broken to be forgiven? Such thoughts seem harmless at first, but they take root. Like a small crack in a mighty wall, they grow and spread, and before long the wall is crumbling. Perhaps the most insidious attack is not to convince a man that God is not real, but that he is indifferent. The enemy does not need us to become atheists. He only needs us to become distracted, discouraged, or numb. If he can keep our minds so clouded with worries, so burdened with self-doubt, so fixated on our failures, then he has won a great victory. For a man who doubts God's goodness will not seek it. A man who feels unworthy of grace will not accept it. A man who believes he is too weak to fight will lay down his sword before the battle even begins. And yet, my friends, there is good news. Though our minds are the enemy's battlefield, they need not be his stronghold. We are not helpless in this war. No attack, no deception, no darkness is greater than the truth of God. But the truth must be known, and more than known, it must be believed. The first defense is awareness. You must recognize when your thoughts are being manipulated. When the voice in your mind is not the voice of truth, but of distortion, the enemy will tell you that you are alone. That is a lie. He will tell you that your prayers are unheard. The mind is not merely a place where thoughts come and go without consequence. It is the very ground upon which the greatest battles are fought, battles that determine the course of a person's life, the state of their soul, and the depth of their faith. It is curious how often we underestimate the significance of our thoughts, treating them as fleeting and harmless, when in reality, they are the architects of our beliefs. Our beliefs are ultimately our destinies. When one wishes to weaken or destroy a person, it is not necessary to afflict their body with illness or suffering. Those things may be painful, but they do not reach the core of a person's being. The surest way to undo a man is to turn his own thoughts against him. The spiritual attacks do not always come in the form of obvious evils. They rarely appear as a terrifying vision or a dramatic temptation. Instead, they come as whispers, subtle, persuasive, and persistent. They do not demand immediate attention but slowly wear away at one's confidence in truth, one's certainty of purpose, and one's trust in God's goodness. The enemy, whether you call him Satan or simply acknowledge the existence of an adversary to the soul, does not often present a bold-faced lie. That would be too obvious. He works instead in distortions. The mind is assaulted not by outright denials of truth, but by small creeping doubt. If a person is told, God is not real, they may immediately recognize it as false and reject it. But if a quieter thought suggests, perhaps God is real, but he is distant, uninterested, indifferent to you, the soul may not so quickly recognize the danger. And yet, it is these half-truths that become the most dangerous, for they subtly pull a person away from faith without them even noticing. If one examines the history of deception, both in the personal lives of individuals and in the broader movements of the world, one finds a common pattern. Before a person acts wrongly, they think wrongly. Every failure of character, every betrayal of goodness, every abandonment of faith begins not in the moment of action, but in the quiet realm of the mind, where thoughts are entertained and beliefs are shaped. The man who abandons his calling does not wake up one morning and decide to do so on a whim. It begins long before that, in the silent errors, convictions of actions. One small compromise, one eternal justification after another, until the mind is so thoroughly convinced of its own new reality that the final decision seems inevitable. The body merely follows where the mind has already gone. It is a terrifying thing to consider how easily a mind can be led astray. If a person does not guard their thoughts, they will soon find themselves believing things they would have once found absurd. They will call darkness light and light darkness. They will rationalize their choices, convincing themselves that what they once knew to be wrong is, in fact, permissible or even good. But such is the nature of deception. It does not rush a person toward destruction. It leads them there by inches, so slowly that they hardly notice they are moving. This is why vigilance over one's thoughts is of the utmost importance. What a person allows to take root in their mind will eventually bear fruit in their life. If they entertain fear, fear will govern them. If they rehearse bitterness will define them. If they dwell on despair, they will soon be unable to see hope even when it is right before them. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire direction of a person's life is determined by what they choose to dwell upon. If the enemy of our souls can control our thoughts, he does not need to control our action. Our actions will follow naturally. It is worth noting that the most successful attacks on the mind are those that do not feel like attacks at all. A person who is anxious rarely recognizes that their anxiety is a form of spiritual warfare. They assume it is simply part of life, something to be managed rather than fought. A person who is overcome with self-doubt does not suspect that their thoughts are being influenced by an outside force. They assume quite naturally that they are simply seeing themselves clearly at last. And yet, one must ask, does truth ever bring hopelessness? Does clarity ever leave a person paralyzed in fear? If a thought leads to despair, if it drains a person of their courage, their joy, their ability to trust in God, then that thought is not merely a passing worry. It is a weapon. And if it is a weapon, then one must recognize that they are under attack. The question then is how one defends their mind against such attacks. It is not enough to simply resist negative thought. Resistance alone is not a strategy. A person who merely tries to avoid thinking wrongly will find that they are constantly engaged in an exhausting battle, trying to push away intrusive doubts, fears, and distortion. The better approach is not just to resist lies, but to replace them with truth. A mind that is filled with truth has no room for deception. The most effective weapon the enemy wields is not brute force, nor is it the sheer magnitude of his attacks. It is deception, the distortion of truth. If one were to face an obvious falsehood, a direct and undeniable contradiction of reality, the mind would recognize it and reject it without hesitation. However, a distortion of truth is far more dangerous, for it masquerades as something familiar, something almost right. The most effective lies are not those that are entirely untrue. Deception operates subtly, often in ways that go unnoticed. It does not approach with a loud proclamation but with a whisper, a quiet suggestion that does not seem alarming at first. A person who trusts in God, for example, is unlikely to be convinced outright that God does not exist. Such a suggestion would be too stark, too foreign to their belief. But if the enemy can introduce a seed of doubt just enough to make them question the nature of God's goodness, just enough to make them wonder whether God's promises apply to them personally, then the foundation of their faith is quietly shaken. You do not immediately abandon their belief, but they begin to hesitate. They begin to waver. The ground beneath them, once solid, now feels uncertain. This is how deception works, not through direct contradiction but through slight, almost imperceptible alterations of truth. The enemy does not tell a person that God has abandoned them. Instead, he whispers that perhaps God is silent, that perhaps he is distant, that perhaps he does not answer every prayer. There is just enough truth in these suggestions to make them plausible. After all, there are times when God does seem silent, when prayers are not answered in the way one expects. And so, instead of rejecting these thoughts outright, the person entertains them. They turn them over in their mind. They begin to feel the weight of them. And before long, what was once a whisper has become a conviction. Distortion of truth is particularly dangerous because it feels reasonable. A lie that is entirely irrational is easy to dismiss, but a lie that plays upon one's emotions, one's fears, and one's past experiences is much harder to ignore. If a person struggles with guilt, the enemy does not need to convince them that God does not forgive. Instead, he only needs to suggest that perhaps God forgives others, but not them. If a person is facing suffering, the enemy does not need to persuade them that God is cruel. He only needs to suggest that perhaps their suffering is meaningless, that perhaps God has overlooked them. These distortions do not require a person to abandon their faith entirely. They simply create enough confusion to make faith feel fragile. History is full of examples of truth being distorted to serve a deceptive purpose. The first recorded act of deception in the human story was not an outright denial of truth, but a subtle rewording of it. When the serpent in the garden spoke to Eve, he did not simply tell her that God was lying. Instead, he took what God had said and altered it slightly. Did God really say? He asked, introducing just enough ambiguity to make her question what she had previously been certain of. That small distortion was enough to lead to doubt, and doubt was enough to lead to disobedience. Same pattern continues today. The enemy does not need to convince people that good is evil and evil is good in one swift motion. Instead, he introduces a slow, almost imperceptible shift in thinking. At first, what is right and what is wrong seem clear, but then over time definitions begin to blur. Justifications are made. A small compromise here, a slight redefinition there, until what was once recognized as falsehood is now embraced as truth. The most dangerous lies are not the ones that demand immediate acceptance, but the ones that slowly erode one's certainty in what is true. The human mind is particularly vulnerable to such distortions because it tends to trust its own reasoning. People assume that, because a thought has formed in their mind, it must be their own. However, not every thought that enters the mind is self-generated, and not every thought is trustworthy. There are influences at work beyond what the eye can see, and the moment a person assumes that their thoughts are entirely their own, they become susceptible to deception. If the enemy can convince someone that their doubts, their fears, and their distorted perceptions of reality are purely their own thoughts, then they will never think to question them. They will simply accept them as truth. The distortion of truth also works by appealing to one's desires. Victory in life, particularly in the spiritual realm, is not achieved through sheer willpower, relentless effort, or even the absence of struggle. It is found in knowing the truth. The truth, once fully grasped, becomes a shield against deception, a light in the darkest moments, and the foundation upon which an unshakable life is built. Many people assume that battles, whether spiritual, emotional, or intellectual, are won by effort alone. But effort without truth is futile. A person may tirelessly against doubt, fear, and temptation. Yet if they do not stand on what is true, they are building their defenses on shifting sand. It is truth that ultimately determines whether a person stands firm or is overcome. Deception is the primary weapon of the enemy, and it is effective only because people do not always recognize falsehood when they see it. The most dangerous lies are not those that are blatantly false, but those that contain a measure of truth, distorted just enough to lead a person astray. If someone can be made to believe something untrue about themselves, about the world, or about God, they will live as though that falsehood is reality. A person who believes they are worthless will act accordingly, even if they are deeply loved and valued. A person who believes there is no hope will fall into despair, even if hope is right in front of them. A person who believes that God is distant or indifferent will struggle to trust Him, even if He is closer than their own breath. The mind does not need to be overtaken by complete but mauled astray. It simply needs to accept a distortion of the truth. Victory then begins with knowing what is true. But this is more than intellectual knowledge. It is a deep, unshakable conviction that withstands the storms of life. It is one thing to know, in an abstract sense, that one is loved by God, but it is another thing entirely to hold on to that truth when circumstances seem to suggest otherwise. It is one thing to know that fear is not from God, but it is another thing to reject fear when it grips the heart. Truth is not merely something to be acknowledged, it must be internalized, believed, and acted upon. It must be stronger than doubt, more persistent than fear, and more compelling than any lie that seeks to take root in the mind. The greatest evidence of this principle can be seen in those who endure suffering without being destroyed by it. When a person faces trials yet remains unshaken, it is not because they have an extraordinary ability to withstand pain. It is because they are anchored in truth. They know who they are, they know who God is, and they know that their circumstances do not define ultimate reality. The person who lacks this foundation will be tossed about by every difficulty, questioning everything the moment hardship comes. But the one who stands on truth remains firm, not because they are immune to pain, but because they see beyond it. There is a reason why throughout history, those who have been most victorious in spirit are those who have clung to the truth, even in the face of immense opposition. The martyrs who went to their death singing, the prisoners who faced down joy in their cells, the persecuted who continued to love their enemies, these were not people who had easy lives. They were people who knew what was true so deeply that even suffering could not shake them. They understood that truth is not altered by circumstances. If something is true in moments of peace, it remains true in moments of chaos. If something is true when life is easy, it remains true when life is difficult. Their victory was not found in escaping hardship, but in knowing that hardship could not strip them of what was most important. This is why the pursuit of truth is the most vital endeavor a person can undertake. It is not a luxury for philosophers or theologians, it is the very foundation of life. To live without truth is to live in uncertainty, constantly swayed by whatever seems most convincing in the moment. But to know the truth is to be unmovable. It is to see through the lies that attempt to take hold of the mind. It is to recognize when fear is trying to take the place of trust. It is to discern when doubt is whispering falsehoods about one's worth or purpose. Truth is a weapon, a defense and a guide. It is the source of real victory. Yet, truth is not something that is simply stumbled upon. It must be sought out, fought for, and guarded. In a world filled with deception, where opinions masquerade as facts and feelings are treated as reality, the pursuit of truth requires intentionality. It requires questioning what is presented, testing what is assumed, and holding fast to what is proven. Many people falter in life, not because they lack strength, but because they lack truth. Strength alone is not enough. A person may be strong, but if they are fighting the wrong battle, their strength is wasted. A person may be determined, but if they are chasing a lie, their determination leads them nowhere. Only the truth can set a person on the right path and ensure that their efforts are not in vain. In the end, victory does not belong to those who are the most powerful, the most intelligent, or the most disciplined. It belongs to those who know what is true and refuse to let go of it. The person who stands firm in truth cannot be manipulated by lies, cannot be ruled by fear, and cannot be led into despair. They are free not because their life is without struggle, but because they see reality as it truly is. And in that clarity, they find the strength to overcome anything. The human mind is a powerful force shaping the course of an individual's life through the thoughts it entertains. Every action, every decision, and every belief originates in the quiet chambers of the mind long before it is expressed outwardly. The direction of a person's life is not determined solely by external circumstances but by what they allow themselves to dwell on day after day. If one were to examine the trajectory of any life, they would find that thoughts precede choices. Choices form habits, and habits ultimately define character. Therefore, the power of thought is not something to be taken lightly. It is not merely an intellectual exercise but a spiritual battleground, where one's destiny is shaped. One of the great dangers of the modern world is the assumption that thoughts are insignificant, that they come and go, without lasting impact. People assume that because a thought is fleeting, it is harmless. However, just as a single spark can ignite an entire forest, a single thought, if entertained long enough, can change the entire direction of a person's life. The way one thinks about themselves, about others, and about God determines how they will live. A person who constantly dwells on fear will soon find themselves paralyzed by it. A person who entertains bitterness will inevitably become hardened and resentful. A person who fixates on their failures will begin to see themselves as a failure. The mind is not a passive recipient of information, it is an active participant in shaping reality. The thoughts that a person dwells on do not remain in the mind alone. They begin to manifest in words, attitudes, and action. Consider a person who spends their time meditating on their grievances, rehearsing over and over again the ways in which they have been wrong. At first, this may seem harmless, a way of processing emotions. But with time, that person will find that their thoughts have taken root. They will become easily offended, constantly suspicious of others, and unable to trust. They will begin to see the world through a lens of injustice, even in moments where no wrong has been done. Their reality will be shaped not by what is true, but by what they have trained their mind to focus on. Similarly, a person who allows fear to dominate their thoughts will not be able to live freely. If they constantly dwell on worst-case scenarios, on potential dangers, on what could go wrong, then their life will be governed by caution rather than courage. They will hesitate where they should move forward. They will avoid opportunities that could have led to great things. They will become prisoners of their own anxieties. Not because their fears were always justified, but because they allowed them to take up residence in their mind. On the other hand, a mind that is intentionally shaped by truth and goodness will produce an entirely different kind of life. A person who fills their thoughts with gratitude will develop a spirit of joy, even in difficult circumstances. A person who meditates on hope will find strength to persevere when others give up. A person who chooses to dwell on what is noble, pure, and righteous will find that their character begins to reflect these qualities. They will see the world differently, not because the world itself has changed, but because their perspective has been transformed. It is no coincidence that Scripture repeatedly urges people to guard their thought. One of the most well-known exhortations on this matter is found in Philippians, where it says to think on whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, and admirable. This is not merely poetic advice, it is a profound truth about the nature of the mind. A person cannot always control what thoughts enter their mind, but they can certainly control which ones they choose to entertain. Just as a homeowner decides who is allowed inside their house, a person has the ability to decide which thoughts are given permission to stay. If a thought brings fear, self-doubt, or despair,